The foreclosure notice had been on the kitchen table for 9 days. Dorothy Keller had not moved it. She had not filed it, had not called Pinnacle Financial back, had not sat down and done the arithmetic that she already knew the answer to. She had simply set a mason jar of sweet tea on top of it every morning, drunk the tea standing at the counter because she always drank her morning tea standing, and then walked out through the back porch and across the gravel lot to the garage and started working. There was always something to work on. That much had not changed. Keller's auto and cycle sat on a flat half-acre off Old Route 23 in the hill country east of Hazard, Kentucky, and the garage had been operating in some form since 1996, when she and Charles had poured the slab themselves over a weekend in October, borrowing a mixer from his cousin Earl, and working until they could not see their hands in front of them. Charles had mixed concrete the way he did most physical tasks, with complete absorption and no wasted motion. And she had worked beside him the way she always worked beside him, matching his rhythm without being asked to, understanding what he needed before he asked for it. The two of them moving through the work like a single organism that happened to have 4 arms and 2 sets of opinions about the aggregate ratio. He had been gone 9 years. She still thought about that weekend every time she walked on the floor of the garage. Every winter when the cold came down off Black Mountain and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a day and the concrete flexed slightly under the stress of it. Every summer when the August heat turned the slab into a griddle and the smell of baked dust and engine oil rose up and became something that was more than a smell. It was a place, a state of being. It was her life made into a surface she could stand on. She was 71 years old. She had been a mechanic for 44 of those years, counting the years before the garage, when she had worked out of a rented bay in Whitesburg, and before that the years when she had learned from her father in the shed behind his house on Car Fork, standing on an overturned milk crate to reach the engine block, handing him tools while he taught her that a machine told you what was wrong with it if you were willing to listen. Her father had died at 63, believing his daughter was the finest diagnostician east of Lexington, and she had never corrected him because she believed he was right. Charles had been many things: a good man and a patient husband, and a person whose laughter came easily and lasted. He had been a reasonable mechanic and an excellent businessman, and a man who understood that a woman who was better than him at something was not a threat, but a gift, and who had arranged his life accordingly. He had run the books and managed the supply accounts and talked to the farmers and the mine workers and the long-haul truckers who had made Route 23 their artery, and she had been under the cars and on the bikes and inside the engines, and between them they had built something real. The interstate reroute had come in 2017. It was the kind of decision that arrived in an official letter with a state agency return address phrased in the bloodless, bureaucratic language of infrastructure optimization, which was a way of saying that someone in Frankfurt had looked at a map and decided that 12 minutes off the drive to Pikeville was worth more than the 36 small businesses that had been built around the assumption that the road would stay where it was. It had not felt like violence when it happened. It had felt like weather, like something that arrived from outside the realm of human decision and simply was. She had adapted the way she had always adapted. New signage on the highway, a website that her niece Lauren built and maintained, though Dorothy herself had never entirely trusted the internet was something as important as the shop's reputation. Phone calls to every farm and mine operation within 40 miles, reminding them she was still open, still capable, still the woman who had once replaced a crankshaft on a coal haul truck at 2 in the morning because the operator's livelihood depended on that truck being on the road by 5. Some of them had come. Enough most months. Other months the electric company had gotten a phone call explaining that the payment would be a week late, and she had learned to have that conversation with a matter-of-factness that required no apology and generated none because the people at the electric company were also people, and they understood delayed payments the way everyone in eastern Kentucky understood delayed payments, which was to say personally and without judgment. She had been 3 payments behind on the mortgage when Charles died. She was 14 behind now. The number on the foreclosure notice was the kind of number that lived at the edge of your vision, the way certain stars were only visible when you did not look directly at them. She knew it was there. She knew what it meant. She simply could not yet afford to let it be fully real, because real meant sitting down in the kitchen chair and doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic ended with losing the garage. And the garage was the last solid thing she had built with Charles that was still standing, and she was not ready to think about that in daylight. So she worked. On a Wednesday morning in the last week of August, when the heat had settled into the Kentucky hills with the particular oppressive permanence of a late-season wave that had stopped pretending it would end soon, Dorothy was underneath a 2009 Silverado that belonged to a rancher named Hank Flynn, working on a transmission that had been slipping for 3 months, while Hank kept telling his son it was fine. She had the truck on stands, both fluorescent work lights angled in, and she was doing what she always did in the early stages of a diagnosis, not looking and not testing, but simply being present with her hands in contact with the housing, feeling for the particular warmth differentials that told a story before any instrument confirmed it. She heard them before she saw them. That was how it always worked with motorcycles. They announced themselves from a distance with a sound that started as a low vibration and grew into something layered and complex, and finally separated into distinct machines as the distance closed. 4 of them, she thought, as the sound turned off the highway and hit the gravel of her lot. Maybe 5. She finished what she was doing. That was not stubbornness. That was the rule she had kept her whole professional life. You did not leave a job half done because something more interesting showed up. The interesting thing could wait. The job could not. She applied 2 more minutes to the work she was in the middle of, reached her conclusion, noted it in the mental ledger she kept of every vehicle she had ever worked on, and then rolled out from under the truck. 4 motorcycles. 4 men, all of them road-worn, in the specific way of men who had been putting on serious miles, the kind of dust and heat fade that came from long days at highway speeds and not from weekend rallies. The bikes were real road machines, dented and scuffed in the credible way of things that had been used hard and maintained carefully. Not show bikes, work bikes. The man at the front was the largest. This was not the first word that came to her, but it was the accurate one. He was constructed on a scale that seemed slightly in excess of what was required for normal purposes, tall and wide across the shoulders, in a way that made the door frame of her shop look like a reasonable choice of exit and nothing more. His hair was the color of a country road in autumn dark brown, going silver, and he had a beard that had arrived at the same destination by a slightly different route, and his eyes were the greenish gray of the Kentucky River in October. He was wearing a leather cut with patches she looked at carefully and directly the way she had been looking at patches on vests since the mid-90s, when the first clubs started coming through on Route 23. Iron Brotherhood, MC, Lexington chapter. She had done work for Brotherhood members before. They had always been straightforward with her, paid fair, tipped better than she expected, never made her feel like the size of them was her problem to manage. He was looking at her with a particular recalibrating expression she had seen on the faces of men who pulled into her lot for the first time her entire adult life. Men who were surprised by what they found. 55 years of this had given her a comprehensive taxonomy of that expression. There was the version that was pure surprise, quickly overridden. There was the version that shaded into condescension, which was the interesting one because it never lasted more than 90 seconds around her. And there was the version that was something else, some men who looked at her and immediately began an internal negotiation that ended with respect, and you could see the negotiation happening in real time. This man was doing the third version. She did not give him time to finish the process. The process could complete itself while she worked. "What's the problem?" she said. Not hello. Not welcome to Keller's. What's the problem? Because that was always the first question, and every other question came after it. He blinked once. Then he pointed at the bike on his right. Christopher has been losing power since Berea. We can feel it hunting. It's going to die before we get back to Lexington. The man indicated Christopher was dark-haired and compact and wearing the expression of a man who had been hearing about his bite problem for 120 miles and was tired of both the problem and the hearing. He nodded once, confirming. Dorothy walked to the bike without waiting for an invitation. She crouched beside it, the negotiation with her knees that she undertook several dozen times a day and which had become purely mechanical, and she put both hands on the engine casing. Not to examine it visually, to feel it. She was quiet for 30 seconds. The four men watched her and said nothing. That was a sign in her experience. Men who talked over the silence were men who did not believe in the process. Men who let the silence be were men who understood at some level that someone was working. Head gasket, she said. Not the carburetor, not the timing. There is a hairline failure on the primary side. You can feel the temperature differential if you know where to put your hands. Combustion gases are bleeding into the cooling system. That is why it hunts at high RPM. You are not losing power from fuel delivery, you are losing compression. She stood up. You got this far without seizing the engine. Another hour at highway speed and you would not have. She looked at Christopher. You felt it pull when you opened it up past 60. He stared at her. Yeah, he said, that is exactly it. She looked at the man who had done the talking. Pull it in, she said, and walked into the garage. His name was Harrison Bishop. She learned this not from him, but from the young one, Michael, who was maybe 26, and had a quality of attention about him that she recognized immediately because her own son had possessed it at that age. That specific, eager absorption in the presence of competence. Harrison was what Michael called him when something required the formal address. The other two called him Iron, which was the call sign she had already assumed from the way the others oriented themselves around him, the way iron filings oriented around a magnet. The loud one was Dallas. He had a laugh that was approximately 40% louder than the occasion required, and a good-natured ease with people that made him likable despite the volume. He was the one who asked questions that made the others visibly wince, not out of malice, but out of an incomplete awareness of how they landed. He examined every tool on her rack with the interest of a man who respected tools, but did not entirely understand them. Christopher Blade, they sometimes called him, was the opposite of Dallas. He said less than anyone. He watched the work with an intentness that was not skepticism, but genuine absorption, the way certain people watched skilled work, memorizing the sequence the way the hands moved, the decisions that happened below the level of conscious explanation. And Michael was everywhere asking questions that were actually good questions, the kind that showed he had been listening and thinking about what he heard. How do you know it is the head gasket from the temperature differential, he said. He was standing at her shoulder, not crowding, staying in the position of a person who wanted to observe without obstructing. The casing runs hot on the combustion side and cooler on the coolant side when the gasket is failing, she said. There is a mixing that happens. It is subtle, but it is there if you know the baseline. She was working as she talked, which was the only way she had ever been able to talk at any length about the work. Talk required her hands to be busy. That had always been true. My grandmother says, machines talk if you know how to listen, Michael said. She said it to him the same way she said things to her apprentices over the years, without emphasis as a plain fact. Tell your grandmother she is right. She was 40 minutes into the job when Harrison spoke from behind her. He had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed for most of that time, watching in a way that she was aware of without making it her business. How long have you had this place? He said. 28 years, she said. Opened it with my husband in '96. He here, Charles. One word. She did not look up from the engine. She put everything into that word that needed to be there and left everything else out. And she could tell from the brief pause that followed that he had heard it. He did not push. She appreciated that about him, that particular quality of restraint. Some people, when they heard that word delivered that way, tried to fill the space with condolence. She had been receiving condolence for 9 years, and she was grateful for it, And also, she was done with it. And the men and women who understood that were the people she wanted in her garage. "Business holding up?" Dallas asked. Blade gave him a look. Dallas registered the look and then did his too loud laugh in the embarrassed register. Dorothy looked up from the work. "It is better than some years," she said, which was accurate in the narrow sense that the shop was still operating, and there had been a period 18 months ago when it had come very close to not being so. Every day it operated was technically an improvement on the alternative. Harrison had not laughed with Dallas. He was watching her with the look of a man filing information, and not just the information she was offering. She finished the job in 26 minutes. She would have preferred 22, but the gasket seating on this particular model required a patience that could not be compressed, and she had never, in 44 years, compressed patience on a job that required it. Christopher started the bike. The engine came up clean and smooth and leveled off into the steady idle of a machine that was running the way it was designed to run, not hunting, not hesitating, not bleeding compression into a place it had no business being. Christopher's face changed. That was the moment she always noticed, not the turning of the key, not the first rev, but the moment the face changed on the person whose machine it was. The particular release of something that had been held taut. "That is it," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been before. "That is exactly what it was supposed to sound like." Harrison pushed off the wall and came to her. She was wiping her hands. "What do we owe you?" he said. She named a number. It was the right number. Not generosity and not gouging. The right number, the one that represented the skill and the time and the materials and a fair return for having both. He reached for his wallet without blinking at it. That told her something. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She was still looking at the bike. "You have got temporary seating on that gasket," she said. "What I did will hold you to Lexington and back maybe more. But the head needs to come off and get properly resurfaced before you put significant miles on it. Any decent machine shop can do it in a day." She paused. "You let it go and you will be looking at a full engine rebuild inside 6 months." He looked at her for a moment. "You could have let us find that out on the way back," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "I did not." Another silence. Then he paid her. She folded the money and put it in her chest pocket without counting it. She would count it later. She always counted later. He looked at the garage, at the tools, at the rate board that Charles had painted in 1996. The prices obsolete now, though she adjusted them in her head whenever she quoted a job. But the board stayed where it was because it was Charles's handwriting, and the lettering was better than anything she would have done. "That board, original," he said. "96, she said. "My husband painted it. He was better at the lettering. I update the prices when I talk to people. The board stays." Harrison looked at it for another moment. He said nothing, but something in his expression shifted in a way she could not entirely classify. She walked them to the back porch and handed out cold water from the refrigerator. If any of them noticed what else was in the refrigerator, and the refrigerator was not full, none of them said anything about it. The foreclosure notice was still on the kitchen table. The mason jar sat on top of it, with the rings from 9 mornings of sweet tea dried into its bottom. Nobody mentioned that either. They drank the water on the porch. The hills were going gold in the late afternoon, the specific Kentucky August gold that came when the heat had been sitting in the trees long enough that the light caught the moisture in the leaves and turned everything to something between amber and green. This was the hour she had always loved on this property. Charles had loved it too. They had drunk evening coffee on this porch 1,000 times and talked about the work and the accounts and the neighbors and the small, solid substance of a life built in one place over a long time. Michael sat on the porch step and looked at the hills for a moment and then said, "You ever get lonely out here?" He said it with the directness of the young. Not a philosophical question, a real one. He genuinely wanted to know. She had a set of answers for that question. She had been giving those answers for 9 years. Fine, staying busy, can't complain. The whole catalog of deflections she had assembled and deployed without having to think about them the way you reach for a familiar tool without looking at the rack. She said instead, "Some days the silence presses in." She did not know why she said the true thing. She had not planned to. Michael nodded slowly. "My grandmother says something like that," he said. "She says some mornings she wakes up and the quiet in the house is a weight on her chest." "That is it exactly," Dorothy said. "That is the whole of it." Harrison was looking at her. She met his eyes for a moment and then looked back at the hills because she had lived long enough to know that when someone looked at you with a particular quality of attention, the kind that saw past the surface of the thing you were presenting, the kindest thing you could do was give them something else to look at while they finished whatever they were working out in themselves. "You should get on the road," she said. "You lose another hour and you will hit Lexington in the dark." They thanked her. All four of them, improperly, the kind of thanks that meant something because it was specific. Dallas shook her hand with both of his. Christopher shook it the way she imagined he shook very few people's hands, with a weight behind it that said the transaction had meant something beyond the mechanical. Michael said, "Thank you, ma'am," and she thought of her son again, the way he had said those two words at that age, with actual feeling in them. Harrison was the last. He held her hand for a moment and said, "I will remember this place." She nodded once. "Okay," she said. They rode out. She stood on the porch until the sound of the four bikes faded around the bend of Route 23 and became the distant rumble and then became nothing. She stood there a little longer because the silence came back quickly in the hills, and she had told the truth about what it did, and sometimes you needed a moment to pick it up again before you were ready to carry it. Then she went back to the garage and finished her notes on Hank Flynn's transmission. That evening, she moved the mason jar and looked at the foreclosure notice. She looked at it for 30 seconds. The number was the same as it had been 9 days ago. It would continue to be the same. That was the nature of numbers on official documents. They waited with a patience that had nothing personal in it. She put the jar back on top of it and went to heat up the last of the soup she had made Sunday. She ate standing at the counter. She washed her bowl and dried it and put it away. She thought about Michael's grandmother and the weight on the chest. She thought about the way Blade had watched her work, absorbing every decision, memorizing the sequence. She thought about Harrison Bishop watching her with that arithmetic expression, like she kept being more than he had prepared for. She let those thoughts move through her, and then she let them go. She had learned a long time ago that holding on to good things that were already over was just a way of being sad about the present while pretending you were happy about the past. The past was done. It had been good. She was grateful for it. The present was what she had to work with. She went to bed. She did not know that 3 hours north on Interstate 75, a man with autumn-colored hair going sober was sitting very still at the back of a clubhouse, staring at the floor with the expression of someone who has just remembered something important that they have been close to forgetting for a long time. She did not know he was thinking about a mason jar on a kitchen table, or about the thin refrigerator, or about the rate board that a man had painted in 1996 in handwriting that his wife could not bring herself to paint over 9 years after he was gone. She did not know he was thinking about his grandmother's farmhouse in Harlan County, the one with the bad foundation and the leaking roof, and the pride that would not ask for help. The one he had left when he was 19 and come back to when he was 34 and found it empty and understood only then how close it had been to falling down. She knew none of it. She was just a woman in the Kentucky hills, lying in the dark in the house that was almost not hers anymore, listening to the silence pressing in. But the world had already begun to move. Harrison Bishop did not talk on the ride back to Lexington. This was not unusual. The others had ridden with him long enough to understand that when iron went internal, the best thing to do was give it room. He was not a brooding man, and he was not in a dark place. He was working. You could feel it if you knew how to read him, which Blade had for 12 years, and which Michael had been learning for the past 3. Blade rode just behind and 2 irons left where he could see the set of the big man's shoulders in the wind. Those shoulders were carrying something they had not been carrying that morning. Not a burden exactly, more like a decision that was still becoming itself, still solidifying from the molten state of impression into the solid state of intention. Dallas rode beside Blade and did not say anything, which was remarkable for Dallas and meant he too had read the moment correctly. They kept formation on the highway with the efficiency of men who had covered a great many miles together and had no need to perform the coordination because it had become as natural as breathing. They pulled into the clubhouse lot a little before 9. The building was a converted equipment warehouse on the east side of Lexington that the chapter had occupied for 16 years, and on a Wednesday night it ran at a moderate hum. 20 men inside, maybe 25. A card game in the back corner. The particular comfortable noise of people who knew each other well enough to be loud and easy. Harrison walked through it all without stopping. He found a chair at the far end of the main room, sat down in it, and looked at the floor. Dallas brought beers and set one in front of him. Harrison did not touch it. Blade sat across from him and waited. This was the only technique that had ever worked with Harrison Bishop, and it required patience, but patience was what Blade had in abundance, more than almost any other quality, and he had been practicing it for 12 years. 4 minutes. She has got a foreclosure notice on her kitchen table, Harrison said. Blade nodded. He had seen it too, or seen enough to understand what was under the mason jar, the careful way she had been positioned in relation to the kitchen table, the particular quality of avoidance in how she moved around it. How bad, Blade said. Bad enough, she has still got it out. Harrison picked up the beer, but did not drink it. Set it back down. Roof has got a soft section over the back corner of the shop. I could see it from outside the way the ridgeline goes. Porch has at least one bad board. She has been stepping over it, you can tell from the wear pattern in the wood. Her fridge had mustard, half a block of cheese, and something she had cooked earlier in the week. Blade was quiet. You got all of that in what, 40 minutes? She fixed Christopher's bike in 26, Harrison said. I had time. Michael had drifted over at some point in the way Michael drifted toward conversations that mattered, drawn by some instinct that was still developing its calibration, but was fundamentally sound. He was standing at the edge of it, listening. Dallas had done the same thing, which was his other talent. His social radar was imprecise at most frequencies, but surprisingly accurate at this one. He showed up near important conversations without being invited and contributed at the right moments. She is out there alone, Dallas said. It was not a question. 10 years alone, Harrison said. She told the kid the quiet presses in some days. He paused. She said it the way you say something when someone has finally given you the right word for it, like she had been carrying the feeling for a long time without being able to name it. The 4 of them sat with that. Then Seth appeared. Seth ran the Lexington chapter with the particular combination of patience and absolute authority that had kept a complicated organization operating through situations considerably more difficult than this one. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with the lean stillness of a man who had made all his dramatic gestures 20 years ago and no longer required them. He had the kind of face that was not attractive in the conventional way, but was impossible to stop looking at once you were looking at it, because it contained the record of too many things to look away from. Michael had gone to find him, Harrison Seth said. He stood at the edge of the circle. Michael says, you have got something. I do not know what I have got yet, Harrison said. Tell me anyway. Seth pulled up a chair and sat. So Harrison told it. He told it the way he always told things, without decoration hitting the facts in the order they mattered. The garage on Route 23. The woman who rolled out from under a truck and did not flinch. The diagnosis by touch in under a minute. The 26 minutes. The price that was exactly right. The water from the thin fridge. The rate board that stayed because it was in a dead man's handwriting. The mason jar on top of the notice. The room had been running at its normal Wednesday night level when he started. By the time he was 4 minutes in, it had dropped to half. By the time he got to the mason jar, the room was silent in the specific way of a room that has stopped everything else it was doing because what is being said requires that. She has been out there 28 years, Harrison said. She fed people who came through. She fixed bikes and trucks for whatever was in a person's pocket. She charged fair and she told the truth. And she sent her truck out for strangers. And she is going to lose that place. He stopped. The room was so quiet, he could hear the highway outside. It was Chance who spoke. Chance was one of the oldest men in the chapter, early 70s, with a face that had weathered enough to look sculpted rather than grown worn down by enough years into something that was mostly structure, mostly the architecture of what was underneath. He moved with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had been through enough that very few things could still move him, and who was therefore significant when something did. He raised his hand slightly. Not a dramatic gesture, the gesture of a man in a meeting who had something to say and was signaling that he intended to say it. "I know her," Chance said. The room shifted. Heads turned. His voice was quiet, and he did not rush what came next. 2007, he said. I was running down toward Whitesburg on 77, and I dropped a chain at about mile marker 90. No phone signal. I walked 3 miles to a gas station, and the guy there made one call, and 20 minutes later a truck came out with a trailer. He stopped. She loaded my bike herself, drove me back to her shop, had the chain replaced and the drive adjusted, and everything checked inside of an hour and a half. I had $60 in my wallet. She charged me $60. Silence. I told her that was too little, Chance said. She told me if I wanted to argue about it, I was welcome to come back when I had more cash. He paused. I told myself I would. I never did. The highway moved and it seemed like a different road after that. But it was the same road it always was. He looked at Harrison. I have thought about her. More times than I said anything about. I just never went back. Something released in the room after that. The way Chance saying it out loud gave other people permission to say their version of the same thing. A man named Garfield said she had fixed a fuel pump for him in 2011 when he was 200 miles from home with $12 in his pocket, and she had taken the $12 and told him to send the rest along if he ever saw somebody who needed it, which was a specific kind of paying forward that made Garfield go quiet when he said it. A woman named Babs, one of 4 women in the chapter, who wore her patches like they had always belonged to her because they had said she had heard the name from a woman in the Pikeville area years ago. The mechanic on 23, they called her. If you break down in the gap between Hazard and Whitesburg, and you can get yourself to her, you are okay. Nobody had known her name until tonight. Seth had been leaning against the wall near the side door since Harrison started talking. He had not moved. He had listened with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was processing something that required full capacity. He looked at Harrison now. Harrison, he said, what are you thinking? Harrison had been staring at the floor. He looked up. I am thinking, he said, and then he stopped and started over. I am thinking we went to her broken and she fixed us. I am thinking she has been fixing people for 28 years and she has got a foreclosure notice on her kitchen table and nobody has gone to her. Seth nodded once. Go on. She told that kid, Harrison said. His voice had something in it now that had not been there before. Not anger, something adjacent to anger, something with edges. She told Michael that the silence presses in. She said it like it was the first time she had said it out loud. She said it like she had been living with it for a long time before she had the right words for it. He was quiet for a moment. She is going to lose that place. And it is going to be a story about a woman alone in the hills who ran out of road and there was nothing for it. And that story is not true. He paused. I do not want to just go back and pay her better for the gasket job. I want to fix the thing that is actually broken. The room was silent. Then Dallas said something that was for Dallas unusually precise. He said, what does fixing it actually look like? What does it actually require? It was the right question. Seth uncrossed his arms. He looked around the room at the faces, not performing the check, but actually reading them, the way a man who had been leading people for 25 years had learned to read a room. What he saw was everyone either already leaning forward or about to, not performing eagerness, actually in. All right, Seth said. Let us talk about what this actually requires. They talked for 2 hours. It started as a conversation and became a plan, and by midnight it had become something that felt less like a plan and more like a living thing. Something that had started with a shape and kept adding parts of itself, finding the gaps and filling them, becoming more specific and more real with every person who added to it. Harrison made the first call at 11:20. Tommy Brent, who did roofing out of Bowling Green, who had done work on the chapter's property 3 times, and who owed Harrison a favor from 2 years ago, when Harrison had spent a weekend helping him move after a fire took most of what he owned. Tommy answered on the fourth ring, groggy, and then stopped being groggy approximately 60 seconds into the conversation. "How bad is the roof?" Tommy asked. "I saw the ridge line sag from outside," Harrison said. "Could be worse. Under. How many squares, you think?" 20, 30. "I do not know." "Okay." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "When?" "Saturday. This Saturday." "Yes." Another pause longer. "Then what time do you need me there?" That was the first call. By midnight, it was the 9th. Dallas was on the phone with an electrician named Gerald, who had worked for the chapter before, and whose side of the conversation consisted primarily of variations on the word "yeah," delivered in escalating tones of commitment. Michael was calling people his age who had skills in trucks, writing names in a notebook with the focused energy of someone who had found exactly the right place to put a feeling that had been building all evening. Babs had contacts in chapters in Tennessee and West Virginia, who between them covered plumbing foundation work and concrete. She had commitments from 2 of the 3 before 1 in the morning. Chance made one call. He did not say who he called. He put his phone in his pocket and said the structural work is covered, and no one asked him to elaborate because when Chance said something was covered, it was covered. He had retired from engineering 30 years ago and had never entirely stopped being an engineer. Seth sat at the long table in the back of the room with a legal pad. He had been an engineer once before he became what he became, and this was not something most people in the room knew about him. But it was true, and it was useful now. He was writing a sequence, not a list of tasks, a sequence, a thing with logic in it that moved from foundation to framing to roof to finish in the order that construction actually required. At 1:15, he looked at the pad. "If half these people show," he said, "we can do this in a day." "They will show," Harrison said. "You are sure?" "I will make more calls tomorrow," Harrison said. Every chapter within range, Tennessee, West Virginia, anywhere within a day's ride. Anybody who has ever been helped by a woman on a back road and never paid it back. He paused. "There are more of those people than you think." Seth looked at him for a moment. Then he capped his pen. "All right," he said. It was Blade who raised the thing nobody had said. He did it quietly, as he did most things. Not for drama, but because it needed to be said, and he was the one who noticed things. "The mortgage," he said. "We can fix every board and every wire and every pipe. She still loses it if the bank takes it." The room went quiet again. Seth looked at Babs. "You had a contact, housing attorney." Babs nodded slowly. "Carol Pierce. She has done work in our network before. Housing specifically. Predatory lending cases." "Call her," Seth said. "She will not want to wait until morning." It was past 1 in the morning. "Then call her now." Babs was already dialing. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. Babs spoke for perhaps 3 of those minutes. Carol Pierce, attorney, spoke for the other 11. When Babs hung up, her expression was the particular combination of satisfaction and seriousness that comes from a conversation that has gone in a direction you were hoping for but did not entirely expect. "She says she needs to see the mortgage documents," Babs said. "She says foreclosure actions on properties like this, small, rural properties with older liens, frequently have procedural violations. Fee structures that were never properly disclosed. Penalty clauses that compound in ways that violate Kentucky statute. She says she would be surprised if there was not something." Harrison was very still. "Get the documents," he said. How Babs said, "I will figure it out." She is not going to just hand them over. "I know," Harrison said. "I will figure it out. He said it with the quiet certainty that meant the topic was done. She got them legally. That is what matters. The room began to wind down around 2 in the morning. People moved out in ones and twos, phones already out as they walked, making calls, sending messages. The night had started as a Wednesday and become something else entirely. The kind of night that would be talked about later, not for its drama, but for the quiet moment at its center. A man staring at the floor. She said the silence presses in some days. Dallas stopped at the door on his way out. "Hey, Iron." Harrison looked at him. "She reminds you of somebody," Dallas said. It was not a question. Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally, "she does." Dallas nodded. "Okay," he said. "I will be there Saturday." Seth was still at the table, the legal pad in front of him. He waited until the room had emptied down to the two of them before he spoke. "Your grandmother," he said. He said it the way he said things that required care. Simply, without turning it into a moment, but with the awareness that it was one. Harrison was at the window. The parking lot was mostly empty, now bikes gone or going. "She never asked for help," he said. "Not once. She would not have known how. I would have known to offer if I had been paying attention." He stopped. "When I was 19, I left Harlan County on a bike I had bought with 2 months of mine wages, and I did not look back the way only 19-year-olds cannot look back, which is to say completely, and with the full conviction that you are moving towards something important enough that nothing you are leaving matters." He paused. She was 62. She had a farmhouse that needed work she could not do alone, and a silence that had a weight to it, and I did not ask the right questions, and she did not tell me because she never told anyone anything that felt like asking. Another pause. "She died in that house," he said. "Roof came through in the back bedroom. She had been sleeping in the front by then. She had been sleeping in the front for 2 years. I did not know that." Seth was quiet. "I am not going to do the same thing twice," Harrison said. Seth looked at the man who had ridden with him for 22 years, who had stood beside him through situations that would have broken most people, who had cried exactly once in his presence, at his grandmother's funeral, the particular contained grief of a man who has held himself together through the whole process of losing someone, and then allows himself one moment to be fully inside it before he picks it back up again. "No," Seth said, "we are not." He capped the pen. "Get some sleep. Saturday is going to be a long day." Harrison nodded. He walked out into the parking lot and stood beside his bike in the warm Kentucky night. The air smelled of late summer, of the particular mix of heat and green that the Kentucky hills produced in August. A smell that had nothing to do with Nevada or Arizona or any of the other places the road had taken him over the years. A smell that was specific to this region and to this time of year and to the particular gradient of elevation that produced it. 400 miles south, a woman was sleeping in a house that was almost not hers. A house with a roof that sagged on the ridgeline. A house with a mason jar on a piece of paper on a kitchen table. A woman who had spent 28 years handing kindness out with both hands and had arrived somehow at a place where there was no one to hand it back. He got on the bike. He did not ride south. It was 2 in the morning and there was work to do before Saturday. But he sat on it for a moment in the stillness that precedes a decision that has already been made, that is simply waiting for the body to catch up with what the mind has settled. Then he started it. He rode north toward whatever sleep the night still had in it, and in his chest, solid and unmistakable, was the feeling of something that had been unfinished for a long time, finally beginning to resolve. Dorothy woke at 5:10 the following morning, the way she always woke, all at once, fully present, with no gradual drift up through the layers of sleep. She had woken this way for 30 years, ever since the earliest days of the garage, when the morning had always contained something that needed doing, and her body had learned to move toward it without ceremony. She lay still for a moment in the dark and did what she always did first. She listened to the house. This was a habit she had developed in the second year after Charles died, when she had begun to understand that a house had its own voice and its own patterns, and that knowing them, knowing which sounds meant nothing and which sounds meant something, was part of living alone in it responsibly. The refrigerator cycling, the particular creak from the kitchen when the overnight temperature had changed more than 15 degrees. The way the August wind moved through the gap under the back door that she had been meaning to seal for 2 winters. She heard all of those and nothing else. She got up, made tea, stood at the counter and drank it. The mason jar was still on the kitchen table. The foreclosure notice was still under it. She looked at both of them from where she stood and then looked away out the window at the hills beginning to come out of the dark, the ridgeline sharpening against the sky as the gray light built. She thought about the man named Harrison Bishop and his arithmetic expression. She thought about Christopher's face in the moment the engine ran clean, the particular loosening that happened when something that had been hurting stopped hurting. She thought about Michael saying, "My grandmother says some mornings the quiet in the house is a weight on her chest." She thought, there are people in the world who pay attention. Not many, but some. She thought, it does not change the notice under the mason jar, but it changed the morning a little. And a changed morning was a place to start. She finished her tea, set the jar down on the counter, rinsed it, and walked out through the back porch and across the gravel to the garage. Hank Flynn's transmission was waiting. There was also a note she had left herself about a brake inspection due on a 2004 Dodge that belonged to a woman in Hyden who had been putting it off for 3 months and who Dorothy intended to call that morning until the woman confirmed an appointment or explained herself. She turned on the lights, the garage filled with its familiar fluorescent hum. She looked at Charles's rate board on the wall, his handwriting, his prices, his particular way with a brush that she would never be able to replicate and had never tried to. It cost her nothing to look at it, and it gave her something she could not entirely name. She put on her gloves and went to work. She heard them at 4:50 in the morning, 3 days later. Dorothy had been in the middle of a dream about Charles. Not a grief dream, just a dream where he was standing in the garage doorway, in the particular way he had stood in doorways, one shoulder against the frame, arms loose, watching her work, with that expression that was half pride and half amusement. The expression that said, "I know you do not need help, and I am not going to offer it. I am just here to watch the best mechanic in the county do what she does." She came up out of it fast, the way she always came up from a dead stop to full waking, and lay still for 1 second identifying what had reached her through the sleep. Sound, low, from the east, from Route 23. She sat up. The sound was not close yet, but it had a quality to it that she recognized at the level of instinct before she reached the level of analysis. Not one machine, not two, multiple rolling together with that layered texture that happened when engines of similar displacement ran in proximity, each one carrying its own frequency, and the whole thing adding up to something that was less a sound than a weather system. She put her feet on the floor, reached for the jeans and flannel shirt she kept on the chair beside the bed. She was dressed in under 2 minutes. The sound was growing. It had direction, and it had steadiness, which meant it was coming here, and it was not in a hurry. The deliberate quality of something that knew its destination. She went to the closet in the back bedroom. Charles's rifle was there, a .30-06 that had not been fired in 6 years, but which she cleaned twice a year and kept loaded because she was a woman alone on a rural property in a county where being a woman alone on a rural property was a statistical reality that required practical consideration. She took it down with the mechanical steadiness of someone who had been taught to handle firearms with respect and had never departed from that teaching. She went to the front window. The horizon was moving. That was the only accurate description of what she saw. The eastern horizon, where Route 23 came around the bend in the hill before it straightened toward her property, was coming alive with light. Not the light of dawn, which was still 40 minutes away. The white light of headlamps, dozens of them spreading wide along the road and down the access track that led to her property, and still coming, the line of them stretching back around the bend and out of sight. The sound had separated now. She could hear individual machines within the larger whole, each one distinct from the others. The whole thing enormous and immediate and aimed directly at her yard. She stood at the window for 3 full seconds. Then she went to the front door and opened it. The porch boards took her weight one by one. She stepped over the third from the left, without thinking about it, 4 years of habit making the motion automatic. She stood at the edge of the porch with the rifle in both hands, not raised, not at rest, held in the position of a woman who had made no decisions yet and was waiting for more information. What she saw when her eyes adjusted stopped her breath, not because it was threatening. That had been her working assumption, the one her nervous system was operating under, the one that had sent her for the rifle and brought her out here in the dark. But the scale of what she was looking at was so far beyond anything that could be processed as a simple threat that the threat response had nowhere to land. You could not be afraid exactly of something this large. You could only try to understand it. Motorcycles, row upon row of them. Their headlights filled her yard and the field beside the garage, and stretched back along the fence line, and back down the access road, and back around the bend of Route 23, as far as she could see in the pre-dawn gray. Behind them, further back on the road, the shapes of larger vehicles, flatbeds and box trucks and pickups with equipment loaded on them, materials she could not yet identify in the dark. And none of them were moving toward her. They were stopping, parking, cutting engines one by one so that the enormous sound reduced itself slowly, like a storm moving through, until by the time the last engine cut, the silence that came back was the strangest silence she had ever heard. Not empty silence, occupied silence. The silence of several hundred people, all choosing in the same moment to be still. She could hear individual things in it. The ticking of cooling engines, someone coughing, the sound of a door latch somewhere in the dark, the soft crunch of one set of boots on gravel, one man walking toward the porch. The pre-dawn light caught him before the features resolved. The build was enough. She had known this man for less than a week, and she already knew his silhouette. Harrison Bishop stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. The rifle was still in her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You going to shoot me?" he said. His voice was level, in the way of a man who had made his peace with however this moment was received, and was not performing. The calm was actually in it. Dorothy looked at him. She looked at the people behind him, the parked machines, the trucks, the materials beginning to be visible as the sky lightened. She looked back at him. "I have not decided," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair enough." "What is this?" she said. Not angry, though her heart was doing things that anger would have been a reasonable explanation for. Just the question. Her first question in any situation. What is this? The same question she asked a broken engine and a difficult customer, and apparently now 65 motorcycles in her front yard before 5 in the morning. He held her gaze. "You fixed our bike," he said. "Today we are fixing yours." She stood very still on the porch. In 71 years, she had been surprised before. Charles's proposal, which she had seen coming and still managed to be surprised by when it arrived. Charles's diagnosis, which she had not seen coming and which had rearranged the next 3 years of her life. The letter from the State Highway Authority about the route change, which had arrived in the same mail delivery as a birthday card from her sister and had sat beside it on the table for an hour before she opened it. 2 pieces of paper with very different intentions. She had experienced the full catalog of things that arrived without warning and changed the shape of what came next. But nothing in that catalog had prepared her for this sentence, delivered by this man, in front of this many people, in the gray Kentucky pre-dawn. "That is not necessary," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. We are doing it anyway." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the patience of a man who had made a decision and was not operating within a framework that included being talked out of it. "I do not need," she started. "Dot," he said. She stopped. Not because he had any right to use that name. She had not given it to him. But the way he said it stopped her. Not commanding, not presumptuous, simply the way you said a word when you meant it. He said, "The roof has a soft section on the west side of the ridge. I could see it from your gravel lot. The porch board third from the left has been soft for long enough that you do not step on it anymore. Your electrical panel is 40 years old, and if the wiring behind it is the same age, it is a fire hazard, and you know it. Your mortgage has fees on it that a lawyer is currently reviewing. He paused. And you have been out here alone for 9 years, doing everything for everyone who came through your door, and nobody has come to yours. Her jaw was tight. She was aware of this. She made herself ease it. One stop at my garage does not mean you know my situation, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. No, he said, it does not. But Chance does. He turned slightly and spoke at normal volume. His voice carried because it was the kind of voice that carried. Chance. A man moved through the crowd from somewhere in the middle of it. Early 70s. A face that looked less grown than formed, worn down by enough years into something that was mostly structure, mostly the architecture of what was underneath. He moved with the unhurried steadiness of a man who knew exactly where he was going. He came up to stand beside Harrison at the bottom of the steps. Dorothy looked at him. Something happened in her face that she had not entirely planned. Not quite recognition, not quite the full assembly of a memory, but the beginning of one. A posture. The way a man stood when he was being careful about something. 2007, Chance said. Route 77. I dropped a chain at mile marker 90. The memory came together while he was still talking. Not the face exactly. The face had changed across 17 years. But the posture was the same. The specific way he had stood in her garage, watching his bike on her lift, with the look of a man who was doing the arithmetic on what he could afford. You had $60, she said. Her voice was quieter than it had been. He nodded. You charged me 60. I know what a chain job costs, she said. I know you do, he said. He looked at her directly. I told myself I would come back. I did not. The highway moved and I let it be an excuse. He paused. I am sorry for that. It took longer than it should have. He said it without theater. The way a man said a thing he had been carrying for a while and was finally putting down. Dorothy looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the crowd. 65 motorcycles and the people who went with them, and behind them on the access road, the flatbeds with their loads of material, lumber and roofing, and pipe fittings, and what looked like a concrete mixer, which a part of her that never stopped being a mechanic was already assessing for mix ratio. And all of those faces in the growing gray light looking at her. Not with pity. This was the thing she had been steeling herself against from the moment she understood what was happening. Pity was the thing she could not have managed. Pity would have broken something in her that she needed to keep intact. They were not looking at her with pity. They were looking at her the way people looked at a foreman when they arrived on a job site. With attention, with readiness, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. She was the foreman. That was the extraordinary thing. This was her property and her garage, and they were all standing in her yard and they were waiting for her. She lowered the rifle. Not a performance, not a gesture, simply the decision that the rifle was not what this moment required. That concrete mixer, she said. Harrison looked at her. The foundation on the north corner, she said. How much do you know about what is underneath it? He blinked once. Just once. Then something in him changed. She could see it. The last piece of a thing settling into place. Chance assessed it yesterday, he said. He was here yesterday. Hairline fractures in the corner footing. Needs to be pinned and poured. How deep is he planning to go? He will tell you that himself, Harrison said. He used to build bridges. Dorothy looked at the foundation. She looked at the mixer. She looked at the particular angle of the north corner where the ground had been doing what ground did in eastern Kentucky, moving with the seasons, pushing at things that were supposed to be fixed. He is going to need to go deeper on the south corner too, she said. The drainage under that footing has been running for years. My husband always meant to address it. She stopped for a fraction of a second. We never got to it. Harrison turned slightly and raised his voice. Chance, you hear that? Already noted it, Chance called back. He had apparently been close enough to hear the whole exchange. Dorothy looked at the crowd again. All those people, All that intention pointed at her property. She looked down at Harrison. "The third porch board," she said. He looked at her. "I have been stepping over it for 4 years," she said. "I tried to fix it myself twice. I used the wrong lumber grade. The heat warps standard grade in under 2 seasons in this climate. My husband knew the right specification. I did not write it down." Harrison said, "Michael." The young man appeared through the crowd with the speed of someone who had been waiting in position. He had a notebook in his jacket pocket that he produced immediately. "Tell him the spec," Harrison said to her. Dorothy told Michael the lumber grade, the board dimensions, the treatment specification, and the length and gauge of the deck screws required for the joist depth. Michael wrote everything down with the focused efficiency of a young man who had found the exact right use for his particular quality of attention. "I know a yard in Hazard that carries it," Dorothy said. "They open at 6. Michael was already on his phone. Harrison was watching her with the arithmetic expression, the one she had been trying to name since the first time she saw it on him in her garage. He kept looking at her like she kept being more than he had budgeted for. "You are not going to just let this happen, are you?" he said. Not a question. "I am letting it happen," she said. "I just want it done right." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but in the family. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Then he called for Tommy. A man materialized from the direction of a truck near the back of the yard, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a particular economy of movement of someone who had been doing physical work for a long time and had optimized every motion. He was carrying a clipboard and had a tool belt already on his hips and a coffee in his other hand. He raised his hand in acknowledgement and came forward. Tommy ran roofing out of Bowling Green. This was clear from the first 3 minutes of conversation, not because he announced it, but because of the way he talked about the work. He showed her the materials list, the grade specifications, the planned drainage correction on the downhill side of the west section, the membrane underlayment that was appropriate for this climate. He was specific about everything, and he expected her to have questions and was right about that. She asked 4 questions. He answered all 4 completely, the last one by pulling out a second sheet that addressed exactly the concern she was raising before she finished raising it. "You have done mountain work before," she said. "Born in Harlan," he said. "Grew up doing roofs with my uncle. I know what ridgeline sag looks like from a bad season and what it looks like from deferred maintenance." He paused. "Yours is deferred maintenance. It is fixable." She nodded. "Okay," she said. "That was the word. 1 syllable. Go." The yard came alive. It was not chaotic. That was the first thing she noticed, and it mattered because she had expected at some level the chaos that came when large numbers of people worked on the same site without a unified system. What she saw instead was the opposite of chaos. It had the character of a large machine finding its operating state, each part locating its function, the whole thing beginning to run with the efficiency of something that had been planned by someone who understood the difference between wanting to help and actually helping. Tommy was on the roof inside 20 minutes, having walked the full surface first, and reported back to her in specific terms before touching a single shingle. The ridge line was worse on the west side than it looked from below, but better than it looked from below on the east. The decking under the worst section had softened, but had not failed. Total replacement of the western third, partial repair of the center section, the eastern third was sound. She listened to all of it, asked 2 more questions, said, "Go." Gerald the electrician was a compact man in his late 40s who wore his experience in the way certain tradespeople wore it, not as attitude, but as economy, every motion and every word reduced to its necessary minimum. He found her before he touched anything and showed her his inspection findings on a clipboard. He had been in the garage by flashlight in the pre-dawn apparently, and the report was thorough. "Junction box behind the compressor," she said, looking at the circled item on his sheet. "First thing we are replacing," he said. "The wiring behind the east wall," she said. Gerald looked at her. "You know about that." "My husband knew about it," she said. "He said he fixed it." She looked at Gerald's notation on the report. The particular way he had written the description told her what she needed to know. He did not fix it, did he?
Ma'am, Gerald said carefully.
There are some things behind that wall that have been there a very long time. I know, she said. She was quiet for a moment. He meant to get to it. Gerald put one hand briefly on her forearm. Not long, not intrusively. The specific touch of a person who understood that sometimes a hand on the arm was the right response when there was no right thing to say. Then he went back to his clipboard and they went through the rest of it together, and she approved every item on the list before he began. Chance was in the dirt beside the north corner of the foundation before 6:30, with two men she had not been introduced to yet working on either side of him. He looked up when she came over and told her in plain language what he had found and what he intended to do about it. He spoke to her the way one engineer spoke to another, without simplification and without condescension, assuming she would follow the technical content and adjusting his language only when her expression told him she needed more context. She followed all of it. She had spent 28 years understanding the structures that houses and garages rested on. She knew what a failing footing looked like, and she knew what the fix required. She had two questions. He answered both. Then he went to work. By 8 o'clock, the property sounded like a construction site. The specific sound of organized work, hammers and drills, and the particular metallic ring of roofing nails going in, and the lower rumble of the concrete mixer, and voices calling measurements across open space. It was the loudest her property had been in years. She walked through all of it. This was her job now, she understood. Not the repair work itself, though her hands itched to be in it at every station she passed. Her job was the oversight, the verification, the conversation with each crew to make sure they understood the specific qualities of this structure and this climate, and this particular way that this property had accumulated 30 years of deferred maintenance and improvised solutions that needed to be understood before they were changed. Gerald needed to know about the extra circuit she had wired in herself 8 years ago to handle the second welder. Tommy needed to know about the way the west side of the roof caught runoff from the hill behind the garage during heavy rain, a drainage problem that no repair would outlast unless the drainage was also corrected. Chance needed to know about the way the south corner had been shimmed 3 times in the years since the foundation was poured, the particular history of it. She told all of them, and all of them listened. Hank Flynn arrived a little after 9. He drove his truck down the access road, got out and stood at the edge of the organized activity for a moment, with the expression of a man who had heard something and come to see if it was true. "Dorothy," he said. "Hank." He looked at the crew on the roof. He looked at Gerald's team running new conduit along the garage wall. He looked at Chance's foundation work and the concrete mixer turning. His face did something complicated, something that was not quite guilt and was not quite relief, but was some combination of both. "I have got 2 cases of water in the truck and sandwiches from the diner in Hazard," he said. "I called ahead. They made 60 of them." He paused. "It is what I had." She looked at him. He had been coming to her garage for 11 years. She had fixed his transmission twice, his brakes 4 times, replaced his wheel bearings, diagnosed a carburation problem that 2 other shops had missed. She had charged him fair every time, and he had paid fair every time. And they had a relationship that was built entirely on the reliability of both of those facts. "I know it is not enough," he said. "Hank," she said, "bring the water." He nodded and went back to his truck. And then he stayed. He found Tommy's crew and introduced himself. And within 20 minutes, he was up on a ladder, passing shingles up to the men on the ridge. And he worked there for the rest of the morning without being asked to. The hardware owner arrived at 9:30. Dawson ran the building supply and Hazard had run it for 19 years. He was a tall, thin man with the particular careful quality of someone who had spent 2 decades making sure other people had the right material for the job they were doing and had developed opinions about materials the way certain people developed opinions about wine. He got out of his truck and looked at the work and walked directly to where Dorothy was standing near the garage door. "I have got 30 sheets of 3/4 plywood in my warehouse that I ordered for a job that fell through 6 weeks ago," he said. "If you can use it, She looked at him. What were you going to do with it otherwise? Let it sit there and feel bad about it, he said, the way I have been feeling bad about other things. She looked at him. I did not call you when the highway moved, he said. I meant to make sure you had accounts that covered the shortfall. I know people who could have sent work your way. He looked at the garage. I did not do it. Bring the plywood, Dorothy said. He nodded and got out his phone. 40 minutes later, a delivery truck from Dawson's Building Supply came down the access road with the plywood and 2 additional boxes of deck screws and a case of exterior primer that nobody had ordered. Dawson himself stayed and found Tommy on the roof and had a conversation about the dormer flashing on the north face that lasted 35 minutes and produced a solution that was better than what either of them had come up with independently. The first civilian vehicle that had nothing to do with the biker network or the local trades arrived at 10:15. A woman named Patrice, who taught at the elementary school in Hazard, who had seen the activity from the road on her way somewhere else and had turned around twice before finally pulling in. She did not have tools. She had a pot of chicken and dumplings she had made the night before for a family dinner that had been canceled, and she carried it to where Michael was working and said, I do not know what else I can do, but I can feed people. Michael, who had been awake since 3:30 and had eaten half a granola bar at 4, looked at the pot of chicken and dumplings with an expression that was close to religious feeling. You can absolutely feed people, he said. By 11, there were 3 more civilian vehicles in the yard. A retired plumber named Dennis, who had heard about it from Dawson at the building supply and came with his own tools and spent 20 minutes in professional conversation with the plumbing crew Harrison had brought before they acknowledged his credentials and put him directly on the deteriorating supply line under the kitchen. A woman named Glenna, who brought her 16-year-old son and asked Babs what she could do, and Babs put both of them to work pulling stripped roofing material and loading the dumpster. Glenna's son arrived with the specific defeated posture of a teenager transported somewhere against his will, and he left 6 hours later with a different posture entirely, the posture of someone who had spent a day doing something that turned out to matter. Babs found Dorothy at 11:30 when Dorothy was in the garage going over the electrical work with Gerald. The lawyer called Babs said. Dorothy straightened. Carol Pierce. She filed the stay of foreclosure at 9 this morning, Babs said. She also submitted the statutory violations to the court and to the bank's legal department simultaneously. Dorothy waited. Babs had been carrying this carefully, like something that needed to be set down without dropping. She said the violations are substantial. 3 separate issues. A fee that was never disclosed in the original loan documentation. A penalty structure that compounds in a way that violates Kentucky consumer lending statute. And a falsified appraisal date that affected the original loan terms. Dorothy was very still. She has filed the stay, Babs said. The bank cannot proceed with the foreclosure while the legal review is pending. Dorothy put her hand on the workbench, flat palm on the wood surface. The worn wood of a bench that had been in this garage since 1996, that had Charles's particular gouges in it from the way he worked, and her own different gouges from the way she worked. She stood there for a moment. Gerald had stopped drilling. He was looking at her from across the garage. You good, he said. Fine, she said. Keep working. Keep working, Gerald said, looking at her with an expression that said he understood exactly what she was doing and respected it. He went back to the panel. Dorothy stood at the workbench for 10 seconds. Then she went to the small window at the back of the garage, the one that looked east toward where Route 23 ran away through the hills and disappeared. She stood there, and she breathed. The foreclosure was stayed. The notice under the mason jar was on hold. The number she had not been able to look at directly for 9 days was at minimum no longer arriving on a fixed schedule. She looked at the hills through the small window. They looked the same as they always looked, green and layered, and close the particular intimacy of Kentucky hill country, where the ridges came down near enough to touch, and the sky was a narrower thing than in other places she had been. She had looked at these hills 10,000 times from this window. This was the view from her garage. This was the view from the last thing she and Charles had built together that was still standing. She let herself feel all of it for 30 seconds. The 9 days and the 9 years and the whole weight of everything she had been carrying in the available silence of the last decade. She let it be present and real and not managed. Then she turned around. "Gerald," she said, "I want that panel finished before 2 o'clock. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He had not looked up from the work. She went back to work. It was Sheriff Cash Slater's car that changed the atmosphere in the yard. Not dramatically, not with lights or sirens, just a county vehicle pulling in around 1 in the afternoon and parking at the edge of the organized activity. And a man in uniform getting out and standing there with a particular measuring expression of a law enforcement officer who had been told something was happening and needed to assess it with his own eyes before he knew how to respond. He was mid-40s, lean, with the watchful quality of a man who had spent 15 years reading situations that were often more complicated than they looked. He made his way through the yard and reached Dorothy near the garage door. "Dorothy," he said. "Cash." He looked at the activity. Roof work, foundation work, electrical on the exterior, 3 different crews. He looked at the 65 bikes lined up along the fence and the access road. He looked at the trucks from Bowling Green and the chapter van from Lexington and Dawson's delivery truck and Patrice's car and Glenna's SUV and Hank Flynn's pickup parked half up on the grass. "Someone called the department," he said. "I am reading directly from the call notes. Report of criminal motorcycle gang dismantling the Keller property." Silence from Dorothy. "I can see that is not what is happening," he said. "No," she said, "it is not." He looked at the new roofing going in at Gerald's conduit, at Chance's foundation work, with the fresh concrete still curing in the August heat. At the food operation Patrice had organized near the fence, where a line of workers was moving through with plates. He said, "Who organized this?" Dorothy pointed at Harrison, who was standing 20 feet away, talking to Seth about something in the low-voiced, efficient way they communicated when there was work to manage. Cash Slater walked over to Harrison. Dorothy watched the 2 men look at each other for the 5 seconds that it took for people who held authority in different domains to take each other's measure. It was the particular silent calibration that happened when 2 people who were accustomed to being in charge of a situation met someone else who was also accustomed to being in charge of a situation. It lasted about 5 seconds. Then Harrison extended his hand. Cash shook it. She watched them talk for about 3 minutes. Harrison speaking, Cash listening with his arms crossed, then uncrossing them, then asking something, then listening again. Then Cash nodding slowly, then Harrison nodding, then they shook hands again. Cash walked back to Dorothy. "He says they will be cleaned up and out of the yard by 9 tonight, Cash said. "He says if I see anything that concerns me, I should come to him directly." He paused. He said, "Please." Dorothy absorbed this. "He does that," she said. "Thinks ahead." Cash was quiet for a moment. He looked at the activity in the yard. He looked at Patrice's food operation and at Glenna's son on the roof handing shingles up to Tommy's crew, and at Chance in the dirt with a level, checking the set of the new footing. "I am going to stay," Cash said. He paused. "Not officially. I am going to take my jacket off and stay." He looked at her. "Your fence post at the highway entrance has been listing since spring. I have been meaning to come by." "It is about 12 degrees off," Dorothy said. "I know," he said. "Post digger is on the east wall of the garage," she said. "Second peg from the corner." He went to find it. And Cash Slater, sheriff of Perry County, spent the next 4 hours in his undershirt, fixing her fence line, and helping Hank Flynn pass materials up a ladder, and eating chicken and dumplings from Patrice's operation, and talking to a man from the Tennessee chapter about road conditions on the mountain routes through Harlan. Dorothy walked through all of it from the center of it. Workers came to her with questions, and she answered them. Gerald brought her decisions, and she made them. Tommy called down from the roof twice for her input, and she gave it. At 2:30, she climbed up. Tommy walked her across the new roof with the care of a man showing work he was proud of and wanted properly assessed. He showed her every seam, every flashing junction, every drainage correction. He showed her the membrane underlayment and explained why it extended the way it did past the eave line. He showed her the dormer flashing that he and Dawson had worked out a solution that was better than standard for this specific exposure. "This is good work," she said. "Thank you." She stood at the ridge and looked out over the property. The yard below was full of activity and people, 65 bikers and 40 or 50 locals from Hazard and the surrounding area, all working the same job. Hank Flynn was up on a ladder beside two men from the West Virginia chapter she had not been introduced to yet. Patrice had organized an actual food operation out of her car, and two church women who had arrived at noon with pots of food. Dawson was on the ground with a tape measure and a chalk line. She stood at the ridge of her garage roof in the August heat and looked at it. This was her property. This had been 14 payments behind on a foreclosure notice for 9 days. This had been the last solid thing that connected her to Charles and the life they had built together. And it had been sliding toward a bank's legal department with the slow inevitability of a thing that had already decided how it was going to end. She let herself feel all of that, the full weight of 9 days and 9 years, and the silence that pressed in, and the rate board she could not bring herself to change, and the mason jar on the kitchen table. She felt it completely, and it was enormous. And then it passed through her and left her standing on the ridge of her own garage roof in the Kentucky August sun, which was real and solid and hers. She climbed back down the ladder. Harrison was at the bottom. He looked at her with an expression she had been trying to name since the first time she saw it on him in her garage the day before yesterday. Now standing on the ground with the work going on around her and the afternoon getting toward its softer angle, she thought she had it. Recognition. That was the expression. The specific look of someone who sees in another person something they know, something they can identify because they have encountered it before. Something that requires no explanation because the understanding of it is already present. Babs found her at 4. Dorothy was in the garage checking Gerald's finished work on the east wall circuit. She was going over the new routing with her hands the way she always went over new work. Not because she did not trust it, but because she needed to know it, to have it in her hands so that she would always know where every wire ran and why. Babs said from the garage door. Dorothy looked up. Carol Pierce, called Babs said. The bank's legal department called her back at 2. Dorothy waited. Babs said they are withdrawing the foreclosure proceeding. The garage was loud. Gerald's drill voices from outside, someone on the roof, calling measurements down to someone on the ground. Dorothy stood very still. Once they saw the violations documented, the exposure was too large, Babs said. Carol says in her professional opinion, the bank was aware of the issue. She says she has seen this fee structure before from this particular lender. She used the word systematic. Dorothy put both hands flat on the workbench. Carol is filing for a full audit of the loan history, Babs said. She says the outstanding balance after the audit, after the illegal fees are removed, and the interest overcharges are corrected, is going to be significantly different from the number on the notice. How different, Dorothy said, Babs told her. She said it carefully, the way you said something to a person who had been carrying a number that was too heavy to look at directly, when the number you were offering them was a different number, a real one they could actually see. Dorothy was quiet for a long time. Around her, the work went on. The sound of tools and voices, and someone on the roof calling out, and Chance somewhere outside giving direction in his quiet, precise way. Gerald had stopped working. He was standing across the garage, looking at her. "You okay?" he said. "Keep working," she said. "I want this panel finished before dark." He looked at her. "Please," she said. He went back to work. Dorothy stood at the workbench with her hands flat on the wood. She looked at the space around her, the new wiring running clean along the east wall, the junction box behind the compressor gone and replaced with the right hardware, the lighting circuit rewired so it stayed steady when the compressor kicked on, the way it had never stayed steady in 40 years of that wiring doing what wiring did. Charles's rate board was on the wall. The prices were wrong by nearly 3 decades, but the lettering was right, the particular way he made his fives, with the flat top and the curve at the bottom, the way her father had taught him at a Sunday dinner in 1989, in which he had never lost. She looked at it until she was done looking. Then she looked out the small back window at the hills. The foreclosure proceeding was withdrawn. The number under the mason jar was not the number she had been unable to look at. The number was different. The number was real. She stood there, and she let it be true. Then she turned around and went back to work. The sun was getting low and soft by 5 o'clock, the specific Kentucky late afternoon light that turned the hills from green to something between gold and bronze, and made every shadow twice as long as it had any right to be. The work had entered its closing phase, the finishing details and the cleanup, the crews moving through their final sequences with the satisfied efficiency of people who had done something real and were reaching the end of it. Gerald presented her with the electrical diagram at 5:30. He had drawn it by hand on a sheet of heavy paper, the layout of every circuit in the new installation, every breaker labeled, every run mapped in precise lines. He put it in a plastic sleeve from his kit bag. "Keep it where it stays dry," he said. "Anyone works on your electrical after this, they see this first." "Anyone works on my electrical after this, Dorothy said I will be standing there with them. But I want it too." He handed it to her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it on the workbench where she would see it every morning. She walked the garage alone, front to back and back to front, slowly the way she had always walked it after a major change, the way Charles had walked it with her, after every significant repair or improvement, both of them moving through the space, letting it register, letting the new version of it settle into the understanding of what it had always been. The east wall was clean. The wiring that had been there since before she and Charles had owned the building, the wiring that Charles had said he would address and had not addressed, was gone, replaced with wire that was correct and safe and appropriate for the load she put on it. She ran her hand along the surface of the wall where the new conduit ran, and she felt the geometry of it, the precision of Gerald's routing, the way every junction was accessible and every run was labeled. She stopped in front of Charles's rate board, his handwriting the prices in the wrong decade, the particular way the paint had dried slightly thicker on the horizontal strokes than on the verticals, because that was how he worked a brush. Consistently, characteristically, Charles. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back outside. Harrison found her at 6. The light was going amber, now the particular warmth of a Kentucky evening in late August, when the heat was still present but had stopped insisting, and the sky had begun its shift towards something gentler. He had 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without asking, and she took it without comment, which was the right exchange for both of them. "Bobby finished the roof at 5:30, Harrison said. "He wants to walk you through it before he signs off. Says he will not close out the job without the owner's sign-off." She had been on the roof earlier. She went up again. Tommy walked her through every section one more time, pointing out each choice and explaining each decision. He showed her what the annual inspection should look for and where. He showed her the specific drainage points that needed to be checked after heavy rain. She checked everything he showed her. "This will hold 20 years, he said. "Minimum, if you do the annual checks." "Show me what to look for in the annual check." He showed her. She asked 2 questions. He answered both completely. "Good work," she said. "Better than the original." "The original was done right for the materials available in 1994, he said. "I had better materials and I knew your specific exposure." She nodded. She climbed back down. The cleanup had its own rhythm. The organized reverse of the morning's arrival, each crew moving through its closing sequence, materials sorted and loaded tools accounted for, debris hauled to the dumpster. Every person she passed was moving with the specific efficiency of a large job, ending correctly, the satisfaction of something completed in it. The yard was still full of people and vehicles, and the particular warmth of a crowd that had worked hard together and was beginning to move toward the end of a long day. But the sound of it had changed from the sound of active construction to the sound of active completion, which was different in the same way that a river at full flow was different from a river finding its bed at the end of the rain. Dorothy walked through it, and she was the foreman, still the last check, the final eye on each crew's work before she released them. She spoke to Chance and he told her what the foundation would need over the next 48 hours as the new concrete cured. She spoke to Gerald one more time about the panel. She spoke to Tommy about the dormer. Each of them talked to her the way tradespeople talk to a property owner who knew what they were looking at, directly, specifically, without condescension or simplification. It was, she thought, the best kind of professional conversation. At 7, Patrice appeared at her elbow. "I called the diner in Hazard," Patrice said, "and I called the women's auxiliary at the church. Between them, they can do a proper meal for everyone here. Food will arrive in about an hour and a half." She paused. "I told them you were buying. I hope that is all right." "How much?" Dorothy said. Patrice told her. Dorothy thought about the number. Then she thought about the number that had been under the mason jar and the number that was replacing it. The real number, the one that was manageable. "Tell them yes," Dorothy said. Patrice was already texting. The last conversation of the evening before the dinner arrived happened near the garage door. Chance found her there. The day's work had wound down to the cleanup phase, and the particular quality of the crowd had shifted from the warmth of shared work to the slower warmth of an ending that everyone knew was an ending. "I have been trying to figure out how to say something," Chance said. He was holding his coffee cup and not looking at her directly, which was unusual for Chance, who generally said whatever he had to say with his eyes on the person he was saying it to. Dorothy waited. "When I was out here in 2007, he said, I told you that what you charged me was too little, and you told me to come back when I had more money." He paused. "I have been carrying the amount I owed you ever since. Not as a debt, not exactly, more as a reminder of a thing I should do." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is 60 years of inflation on $60, he said. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She did not take it right away. "Chance," she said. "It is not charity," he said. "It is arithmetic." He said it the way an engineer said things, with the particular confidence of someone who had done the calculation and was comfortable with the answer. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the envelope. She did not open it. She folded it once and put it in her chest pocket. "That squares us," she said. He nodded. "That squares us." They stood together for a moment in the comfortable quiet of two people who had said the thing that needed saying and did not need to fill the space after it. "You will come back through," she said. He looked at Route 23, at the hill beyond it, at the dark shape of the ridgeline against the last light of the sky. "Yeah," he said. "I expect I will." He finished his coffee and set the cup down and went to find his bike. The food arrived at 7:45 in a convoy. The diner's catering van came first, followed by 2 church vans and Patrice's car, with 2 women from the auxiliary who had organized the serving setup with the efficiency of people who did this twice a year and had a system for it. Within 35 minutes, the yard had been reorganized into something that looked, in the fading Kentucky evening, like a gathering. Tables end to end from the flatbeds, food laid out with the abundance of people who had cooked for a crowd and added 20% because that was the correct arithmetic when you were cooking for a crowd. 65 bikers and 50 or 60 people from Hazard and the surrounding county sat down together. There was no ceremony about it. People found seats the way people found seats at community events, next to whoever was already there, next to whoever had been working alongside them all day, next to whoever had the food they wanted. Tommy ended up at a table with Dawson and 2 women from the church auxiliary and a man from the Tennessee chapter whose given name turned out to be Theodore, which nobody used. The conversation Dorothy caught fragments of as she moved through the yard was about roofing pitch in high humidity climates and whether modified membrane was superior to standard in this region. And both Dawson and one of the church women had opinions that they were not keeping to themselves. Cash Slater, still in his undershirt, his uniform jacket over the back of his chair, was sitting with Seth and Chance and Dennis, the retired plumber. They were talking about Perry County road conditions and the state of Route 23 specifically, and Cash was doing considerably more listening than talking, which Dorothy suspected was unusual for Cash. Michael was at a table with Glenna's teenage son, and the two of them were talking with the rapid, energized quality of people who have discovered unexpected common ground. Hands moving, laughing at something she could not hear from where she stood. Chance was sitting at the end of one of the long tables, eating slowly, looking at nothing in particular. Not the alone of a man who wanted company and did not have it. The deliberate alone of a man who needed quiet to process something and had found the configuration he needed. Dorothy brought him a second plate without being asked. He looked up. "Thank you," he said. She sat down across from him. She had not planned to. She had been moving through the yard, and something about the way he was sitting made her stop. "You came back," she said. "Eventually, 15 years late." "Better than not," she said. He looked at the food in front of him. "I thought about you," he said. "More than once. The year after I was there, and then a couple of times after that when I broke down somewhere else, and somebody helped me. And then when I helped somebody once on the road out near Whitesburg, a man with a flat and no spare, and I stopped and helped him change it, and he tried to pay me, and I remembered what you had said." He paused. "Send it along if you ever see somebody who needs it. That was what you told me." She nodded. "I thought about coming back," he said, "but it always seemed like there would be a better time. A time when I had more to bring." He looked at his plate. "There is never a better time." "You told that room about me," Dorothy said. "When Harrison was talking, you stood up. You said, 'I know her.' Before that, it was just a story he was telling. After that, it was true." He considered this. "You were the witness," she said. "Rooms need a witness. You were it." He was quiet for a moment. "Your husband. He was a mechanic too. Better than me in some ways," she said. "He had a feeling for metal that was different from mine. More intuitive. He could hear a problem sometimes before he could explain it." She paused. "Not better overall, but I would not have told him that." Chance made a sound that was partway to a laugh. "He knew anyway, I would bet." He knew. She said it simply. He liked it. He was not a man who needed to be the best at the thing his wife was best at. It made him proud instead. That is a specific kind of man and not a common one. She left him to his eating and kept moving. Harrison found her at 8:30 when the evening had gone fully dark and the generator lights were running, casting the yard in the warm, practical glow of working light. Most of the construction cleanup was done. The dinner had moved into its second phase, the phase after the eating, when people sat back and the conversations deepened, and the satisfied fatigue of a day's hard work settled into the body and made everything warmer and slower and more genuine than it had been at the beginning. He came to where she was standing near the garage door. He had a cup of coffee. She had coffee too. They stood together in the way they had been standing together in fragments all day, side by side, watching the work, not requiring anything of the quiet. "What happens tomorrow?" she said. He looked at her. She said, "All of this ends tonight. People go home. The highway still moved. The town is still small. I am still 71 years old, and I am still running this place alone." She said it without self-pity. She had not had self-pity in her inventory for a long time. She was simply moving to the next set of facts the way she always moved through the world, problem to problem, eyes open, no drama. "I appreciate what you did today," she said. "I appreciate it more than I know how to say properly, and you should know I am not a person who usually runs short on words. But I want to know what tomorrow actually looks like." He was quiet for a moment. "Different," he said. "That is not an answer. It is the beginning of one." He turned slightly to face her more directly. "There is a reporter at the Hazard Herald. She has been here all day taking notes. The freelance photographer who came out, his name is Mark. He has a contact at the Associated Press. He told me he thinks this story moves nationally." He looked at her. "The kind of story that does that puts Keller's Auto and Cycle on a map that is bigger than the one the route change took you off of." She drank her coffee. "That could be nothing," she said. 2 weeks of noise and then nothing. "It could be loud," he said. "And loud for a mechanic who does the work right and charges fair and tells the truth about what a machine needs. Loud means new customers, new accounts, new people coming down Route 23 specifically because they heard the story." He paused. You fixed bikes for everyone who came through here for 28 years. You fixed them well, and you charged fair. That does not stop being true because fewer people know about it. It just needs more people to know." She looked at the yard, and the other part, she said, the part where I am alone. He looked at her steadily. "I am coming back," he said. He said it quietly and without performance. Not once, not as a courtesy visit. I am going to come back because he stopped and started over. My grandmother died in a farmhouse in Harlan County with a bad roof and a failing foundation, and I was on the road. I told myself I was too far away and too busy, and I was wrong about both of those things, and I have known I was wrong about both of them for 12 years. His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. Not the managed version. The actual feeling sitting close to the surface, the way certain things sat when a person had held them at arm's length for a long time and finally let them come near. "You are not going to be alone on this property and have me know about it," he said. "I cannot fix what I did with her, but I can choose not to do it again." She looked at him for a long moment. "I am not your grandmother," she said. She said it gently but clearly. It needed to be said. "No," he said, "you are not. You are Dorothy Keller, and you are the finest diagnostician I have ever watched work. And you charge fair, and you tell the truth, and you give cold water to strangers off your back porch." He paused. "I am coming back because of who you are, not because of who you remind me of." The distinction mattered. She could see that he knew it mattered, and that he had thought about it before he said it. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, like he was making sure he had heard it correctly. "All right," she said again, which in her language meant, "I believe you. We can proceed." He nodded once. Then Michael appeared from somewhere with slightly too much momentum, like he had been moving from somewhere and had not quite finished decelerating. "Deacon wants everyone together before we ride out," Michael said to Harrison. He looked at Dorothy. "Can you come out front?" She followed Harrison around to the front of the garage. What she found was something she had not been prepared for, which in itself was notable because Dorothy Keller had developed over 71 years a comprehensive preparation for most of what the world had to offer. Not a formal gathering, not a ceremony with a program, just people, all the people who had been scattered across her property all day, coming together in the organic way that groups moved when something was ending and they all understood it was ending. The bikers and the locals from Hazard Cash Slater, still in his undershirt, Patrice and the churchwomen, Hank Flynn with his hat in his hands, Dawson at the edge of the group, Glenna and her son. They were all there, all of them moving to the front of the garage without being asked the way people moved toward each other when a moment was real enough to require proximity. Seth was standing in the open garage doorway. When the crowd had settled into its shape, he spoke. He did not project his voice. He simply spoke at the volume of a man talking to people who were close enough to hear him, and the crowd went quiet to receive it, which was the truest form of authority. "Most of you did not know each other this morning," he said. "You came from different places in different lives, and you spent the day on the same property doing the same job." He looked around the faces. "You are not strangers anymore." He paused. "You built something today that has the roof and the foundation and the wiring in it," he said, "but it is made of something other than those materials. It is made of the decision to show up instead of drive past." He paused. "That is harder than it sounds. Most people drive past. You did not." The yard was still. Seth looked at Dorothy. She stepped forward. She had not prepared a speech. She had not thought about what she would say, but she had 44 years of experience with the truth, and she had never been at a loss for it. "I have been on this property for 28 years, she said. "The last 9 I spent deciding that the world had moved on and taken everyone with it." She looked at the faces. The bikers from Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia, and the people from Hazard, Cash Slater and Patrice, and Dawson and Hank Flynn, and Chance and Michael, and Glenna and her son, and all the rest. "I was wrong about that," she said. "I was wrong about it for 9 years, and I am old enough and honest enough to say so plainly." She paused. "I do not know all your names. I am going to learn them. And when you come through here and you need something fixed, I am going to fix it. And if I charge you less than it was worth, that is my right as the owner of this garage. So do not argue with me about it." A sound went through the crowd. Not quite a laugh and not quite a cheer, but something that was both the specific sound of people responding to something that was exactly as real as it felt. Then Harrison stepped forward. He was carrying something she had not noticed him holding until this moment, a flat object wrapped in a cloth about the size of a license plate. He unwrapped it as he walked toward her. Cast metal heavy, the kind of thing made to endure the particular indignity of Kentucky weather, the freeze and thaw cycles, and the summer heat and the ice storms that came off the ridge in January and tested everything they touched. The engraving read, "Keller's Roadside Auto and Cycle, home of the 65 Brotherhood." Below that in smaller letters, "A debt paid in full." She took it from him with both hands. She looked at it for a long time. The crowd was quiet around her. Not the pressing kind of quiet she had described to Michael. The other kind. The kind that was full of people choosing to be present in a moment because the moment was worth being present in. Her eyes went blurry. She did not blink it back this time. She had been holding things back her whole adult life, holding them at the managed distance that a woman who ran a business alone in the hills of eastern Kentucky needed to hold things at in order to keep moving. She was very good at it. She had decades of practice. She did not blink it back. She stood in front of 65 bikers and the neighbors she had been convinced had forgotten she existed, and she let it be real. All of it, the 9 days and the 9 years, the mason jar on the kitchen table, the rate board she could not paint over the south corner, Charles had always meant to address, the silence that pressed in on certain mornings and would not lift until she went to the garage and put her hands on something solid and true. She let all of it be real, and it was enormous. 30 seconds. Then she looked up. Harrison was standing in front of her with that expression she had finally named. Recognition. "I thought I fixed one motorcycle," she said. Her voice was not steady, and she did not try to make it steady. He looked at her. "No, Dorothy," he said. "You fixed a whole lot more than that." The engines started one by one, spreading through the parked machines, the way sound spread from its source, each one catching from the one beside it, until the whole yard was full of it. The sound she had heard approaching 4 hours before dawn that morning, that had come around the bend of Route 23 like a second weather system. The headlights came up. The procession began to move slowly through the yard and back to the road, 65 machines, in a river of light that went on longer than she could see, that stretched back along the access track and curved around the bend and disappeared into the dark of the Kentucky hills. The people from Hazard stood in her yard and watched them go. Dorothy stood among them with the plaque in both hands, and she watched every one of them pass. Cash Slater was beside her jacket over his arm. Patrice was on her other side. Hank Flynn was 2 people back with his hat in his hands. Dawson was at the edge of the group, and when the last bike went by, he turned and looked at her and gave her a single nod that contained everything a nod could hold: acknowledgement, an apology, and a promise all together. She nodded back. The last engine faded around the bend. The hills went quiet. Not the pressing kind. The kind of quiet that was full of what had been in it, that was resting the way ground rested after rain, holding what had been given to it. She put the envelope from Chance in her workbench drawer when she went back inside the garage that night. She did not count it until the next morning, standing at the workbench with her coffee. She wrote the amount in the small notebook she kept for the accounts, in the column for things that did not fit the normal categories, and she looked at it for a moment and then put the notebook away. 3 weeks later, the reporter's story ran in the Hazard Herald on a Thursday morning. It was 900 words and 4 photographs, and it ran above the fold on the front page, which was the kind of editorial decision that a small-town newspaper made once or twice a year, about a story that was simply too true to put anywhere else. Mark sent his photograph to the Associated Press the same day. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by 11 outlets. By the end of the week, it had moved through social media with the particular velocity of a thing that touched something in people that they had not known needed touching until it did some combination of the plaque and the rate board and the mason jar and the expression on Dorothy's face in the photograph where she was looking at the plaque for the first time and was not trying to hold it back. The phone started ringing on the third day. A man from Paintsville who had been broken down on Route 23 in 2004 and had been helped by a woman who never gave her name, called to ask if it was her. It was. He came the following Saturday with 4 friends, all of them on bikes, all of them with various things that needed attention. She spent 4 hours on their machines and charged fare, and they stayed for coffee on the porch after. And she learned their names, and they learned hers. 2 women from a riding club in Lexington drove out specifically to meet her 2 weeks after the story ran. They left 4 hours later having had their carburetors adjusted, their chain tension corrected, their oil checked, and having drunk 2 cups of coffee on the porch while Dorothy told them about the rate board and why it stayed where it was. They told every person they knew. A man named Garrett Webb, who had heard the story in an online motorcycle forum, drove 4 hours from Nashville to have Dorothy look at a persistent hesitation in his touring bike that 3 shops had failed to diagnose. She found it in 6 minutes. Cracked vacuum line at the secondary intake, barely visible intermittent leak that only manifested at operating temperature. She fixed it in 20 minutes and charged him $40. He sat on her porch for an hour and then drove back to Nashville and wrote about the experience in a way that several thousand people read. She put the plaque inside. The Kentucky weather was hard on metal. The freeze-thaw cycle alone could pit the surface inside a decade, and she was not going to let it fade. She put it on the workbench where she could see it every morning when she turned on the lights. Michael came back in September to hang the new sign. He drove out from Lexington on a Saturday with the sign in his truck and Blade riding alongside. She learned that day that Christopher Blade taught high school history in Richmond. This explained the quality of his attention and the way he had watched her work that first day in her garage, the specific absorption of a person whose professional life consisted of understanding how competence was built and transmitted. The sign was hand-lettered on oak boards sealed for the weather, fitted with heavy hardware for the doorframe. Keller's Roadside Auto and Cycle, home of the '65 Brotherhood. She watched Michael hang it. When he stepped back, she looked at it from 20 feet. Left side up a quarter inch, she said. He adjusted it. Better. Level, she said. He grinned. The same grin she had seen on him since the first day in her garage. The grin of a young man who had found someone worth paying attention to. Carol Pierce drove out on a Saturday in October with the final audit results in a folder. She set the folder on Dorothy's workbench and opened it without preamble because Carol Pierce was a woman who respected other people's time and understood that the information in the folder spoke for itself. The number was there in plain language. The outstanding balance after the full audit of the loan history, after the removal of the improperly disclosed fees, and the illegal penalty structure, and the interest overcharges that had been compounding in violation of Kentucky consumer lending statute. Dorothy looked at it. "This is a number I can work with," she said. "That is my assessment as well," Carol said. "With the current trajectory of the business, this is manageable." "What do I owe you?" Dorothy said. "I told you pro bono." "I know what you told me," Dorothy said. "I am asking again." Carol looked at her. She had been looked at by a lot of people in her professional life, but this particular quality of directness had a specific weight to it that she recognized as genuine. "My car has been making a sound when I decelerate," Carol said. "Intermittent. I have been meaning to have it seen to for 3 months." "Pull it in," Dorothy said. It was a worn rear brake pad, unevenly worn because of a caliper that had been sticking intermittently, which was also the source of the pull Carol had been attributing to the road surface. 25-minute job. Dorothy did it while Carol sat on the workbench, and they talked not about the mortgage and not about the audit, but about Carol's mother and the house she had grown up in and what had happened to it, and why Carol had become the specific kind of lawyer she had become. Dorothy listened the way she always listened, which was completely the way she listened to an engine without pre-deciding what she was going to hear. When it was done, Carol tried to pay. "We are square," Dorothy said. "We are not remotely square," Carol said. "I saved your house, and I fixed your brakes," Dorothy said, "which means I arguably saved your life." So, Carol looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, sudden and real, the laugh of a person who had not expected to be surprised. "All right," she said, "we are square." They shook hands. Harrison came back the first time in late September alone on a Tuesday. She heard the bike on Route 23 and knew it before she saw it. The specific sound of his machine, which she had learned the same way she had learned the sound of every regular customer's vehicle over 28 years, by the particular combination of engine note and exhaust tone, and the way the rider handled the throttle approaching her lot. He pulled in and cut the engine and got off and walked to the garage door where she was working. He drank coffee on the porch and helped her move a transmission that she had been managing alone for 2 days, working it across the floor of the garage, one side at a time, with a combination of leverage and patience that the absence of a second person required. When she tried to pay him for his time, he said he had not done enough to be worth paying for. She said she would make that determination. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She paid him $30 and he took it without further discussion, which told her something about his understanding of the way the world worked, that she filed alongside the other things she had been learning about him. He came back in October. He and Dallas came together in November, which was a mistake in terms of noise level, but an improvement in terms of productivity, because Dallas turned out to have a genuine talent for bodywork, the patient, careful kind, and the 1969 Chevelle that had been sitting in the back corner for 8 months suddenly became a reasonable project with 2 more sets of capable hands on it. Chance came in January alone. Unannounced, a Tuesday afternoon, just the sound of a bike on Route 23 turning into her lot. He knocked on the garage door. "Passing through," he said. The garage was 40 miles off the direct route to anywhere he was likely going. Dorothy looked at him for a moment. "On your way where?" "Hazard," he said, which was technically east of her property, technically true in the loosest possible sense of the direction. She handed him a wrench, and he made himself useful for 3 hours. And she fed him dinner, and he said he had a room booked in Hazard. He came back in the morning because he had apparently not found what he was looking for in Hazard, which was fine because she had a transmission that needed 2 people, and he was there. He came back in March. He came back in May. She stopped commenting on it. Michael sent his nephew in November. The nephew was 22 years old, had grown up taking apart his father's lawnmowers and then his father's cars, and had the specific quality of someone who had been learning a skill in isolation and had never been shown how it connected to a larger body of knowledge. His name was Daniel, and he drove out from Richmond one Saturday and spent 4 hours watching Dorothy work and asking questions that were so good she asked him twice if he had formal training. "No, ma'am," he said. "I just watch a lot." She looked at him for a moment. "Come back next Saturday," she said. "Come back every Saturday if you want." He came back every Saturday. "Tell me what you hear," she said to him one morning. He was listening to an engine she had already diagnosed. She wanted to know what he heard. He told her. He was 80% right. He had the location correct, and the mechanism mostly correct, and the cause approximately right. "You are close," she said. "What would change your guess?" He thought about it. "The temperature differential on the secondary housing," he said. "Put your hand on it." He did. He was quiet for a moment. His face did the thing she watched for the specific internal shift of a person receiving information from their hands that their eyes had not supplied. "Oh," he said, "the cross flow is wrong." "That is it," she said. He looked at the engine. Then he looked at her. "That is exactly it." She had heard those words before. She would hear them again. "Good," she said. "Now fix it." He fixed it. In the following spring, Dorothy drove to Harlan County. She had been meaning to go since January, when Chance had told her about the farmhouse. Not the details, but the general shape of it. the way it had stood empty for 12 years, and the way the county had eventually taken it for back taxes, and what had happened to it after. He had told her matter-of-factly, the way he told most things without drama, and without requiring her to respond in any particular way. She had thought about it for 3 months, about the farmhouse in Harlan County, and the woman who had lived in it alone, and the grandson who had been on the road, about the particular arithmetic of absence, and what it accumulated into over time. On a Saturday in April, when the hills were doing what Kentucky hills did in April, going from the gray of winter to the first hard green of spring, in what felt like a single day, she drove south on Route 23 and then on 119 through Cumberland and down into Harlan. The farm was outside the town, up a gravel road that climbed the ridge on the south side of the valley. The house was gone, pulled down by whoever had taken the property, and the site was grown over with the particular aggressive spring growth that eastern Kentucky produced. But the stone foundation was still there. The same stone that had been there when the house was built, set by someone's hands generations back, fitted together with the care of people who understood that the foundation was the thing that everything else rested on. She stood at the edge of the overgrown lot and looked at it for a while. She was not a sentimental woman, not in the traditional sense. She did not require ceremonies or markers or the formal acknowledgement of things that were already true. But she understood the particular human need to bear witness to the places where things had happened, to stand in the physical location of a story and let the location be part of the understanding. Harrison's grandmother had lived here, had spent winters here alone with a failing roof and a silence that pressed in, and the particular pride that kept a person from asking for help, even when help was what they needed. She had died here, and the house had come down, and the foundation remained. Dorothy stood there long enough to do the thing she had come to do, which was simply to acknowledge it, to let it be real the way she had been learning to let things be real, without the management and the distance she had kept between herself and the difficult facts of her life for too long. Then she drove home. She told Harrison about it 2 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon when he came out to help her with the Chevelle. She told him simply and without making it larger than it was. She had wanted to see the place. She had seen it. The foundation was still there, which was the important thing, the thing that lasted. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for that." She nodded. She handed him a socket wrench. The Chevelle's carburetor linkage was not going to fix itself. They went back to work. The day the garage hit 12 months of operational profit, the first time in 6 years, Dorothy was under a 2017 Ram with a brake line issue that had been slowly failing and would have gotten Hank Flynn's neighbor killed if it had failed on the Hazard Mountain Road instead of in the parking lot of the diner where he had noticed the pedal going soft. She was under the truck in the specific state of focused attention that the work required, not thinking about anything except the work, which was the state she had been most reliably herself in for 44 years. She finished the job. She came out from under the truck. She cleaned her hands. She went to the workbench and picked up her phone and called Harrison. He answered on the second ring. "Something wrong?" "No," she said. "I wanted to tell someone." He was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy," he said, "that is the best thing I have heard all week." She looked at the workbench, at the electrical diagram in its plastic sleeve, at the plaque from the day that had changed her year, her decade, her road. Keller's Roadside Auto and Cycle, home of the 65 Brotherhood, a debt paid in full. At Charles's rate board on the wall, the prices, 4 decades wrong, and every stroke of every letter right. "Thank you," she said. It was the simplest, true thing, and therefore the most accurate. "You would have done the same," he said. "I did do the same," she said. "For 28 years, nobody came." "Someone came," he said. "We just took longer than we should have." She thought about that. She thought about Chance on Route 77 in 2007 with $60. She thought about the man from Paintsville who came out the following Saturday with 4 friends. She thought about Daniel arriving every Saturday with questions that got better every week. She thought about the morning 65 headlights came around the bend of Route 23 like a second sunrise. "Yeah," she said. "You did." She set the phone down on the workbench. She stood in the garage for a moment. The lights were on, and the garage was warm and smelled of oil and metal and the particular combination of Kentucky autumn coming through the open bay door, the cool, and the wood smoke, and the last of the summer's green fading out of the hills. She had been standing in this garage for 28 years. She had been standing in it alone for 9. Those 9 years had their weight, and she would not pretend otherwise. The silence had pressed in on the mornings she had admitted it pressed in, and on many mornings she had not admitted it, but it had pressed in anyway. The particular gravity of a life that was very full of work and very thin of witness. She was not alone anymore. This was not a feeling, not a hope, not something she was telling herself. It was a fact accumulated across 9 months of Saturdays and Tuesday afternoons, and a plaque on her workbench, and a nephew learning to read engines by watching her hands, and a rancher who had been meaning to do something about his brake line overpayment for 11 years, and finally did. The road had not come back the way it had left. The road had left with everyone on it, the travelers and the truckers and the bikers on long runs and the lost tourists and all of it, and it had taken the commerce and the noise and the traffic with it and left the silence behind. She knew that. She had lived it. But something had come back that was not the road. Something that was in the ways that actually mattered better than the road. She looked at Charles's rate board. The prices were still wrong. They would stay wrong. She adjusted them in her head when she quoted a job, and she always would for as long as the board was on the wall, for as long as she was the mechanic of this garage. She turned off the overhead light and went to the bay door and looked out at the evening. Route 23 was quiet the way Route 23 was usually quiet. Now one vehicle in 10 minutes, the occasional truck, the occasional bike. The hills had gone from gold to dark against a sky that was still holding a little of the day's last light at the western edge. She stood there and listened. The silence was there. It was always there. It was the sound of a county road that used to carry the world and now carried less. That was still true. She did not need it to be untrue, but the silence did not press in. She had been trying to name the difference for months, the difference between the silence that pressed in and the silence that did not. She had the name for it now. The silence pressed in when you were the only one carrying it, when no one else knew it was there, when the quiet of the house was yours alone and there was no one to confirm it. No one to say, yes, I know, I hear it too. The silence did not press in when someone knew. 65 people had come around the bend of Route 23 on a dark August morning, and they knew. The man from Paintsville knew. Chance knew. Michael and Daniel knew. Hank Flynn on his ladder passing shingles to Tommy's crew knew. Cash Slater with the post digger knew. Patrice and the church women, and Glenna and her son, who had arrived with the posture of someone going nowhere and left with the posture of someone who had been somewhere real, they all knew. The garage was hers. The road was hers. The hills were hers. The work was hers, 44 years of it, not slowing, not stopping. The best thing she had ever done with the time she had been given. And the silence when it came in the evenings was only the quiet of a place resting. Not empty, not abandoned, just resting. Holding what had been given to it. She went inside and heated up the soup. She ate standing at the counter the way she always ate, the way Charles had always said she ate too fast to benefit from sitting down. She washed the bowl and dried it and put it away. She moved the mason jar from the counter to the windowsill, where it belonged, where the morning light hit it and made it look like something worth keeping. Then she went to bed. Tomorrow there was a 2004 Silverado with a persistent oil leak that she had been thinking about since Tuesday and had begun to suspect was a rear main seal going bad rather than the valve cover gasket the owner had been telling himself it was for a year. She had been right about these things before. She expected she was right about this one. She would find out in the morning. She always found out in the morning. The garage would be there. The work would be there. The road outside, quiet as it was, would carry whatever it carried, and what it carried now was enough. More than enough. the right kind. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, the refrigerator cycling, the settling of the floor and the temperature change, the night moving around the property the way it had moved around it for 28 years, the particular soft traffic of an eastern Kentucky autumn, the wind through the trees on the ridge, and the creek at the bottom of the hill, running over the same stones it had always run over, carrying whatever it carried down to wherever it went. She listened until she knew every sound, and all of them were right. Outside, Route 23 ran through the hills, the way it had run through the hills for as long as she had been here. The same asphalt, in the same curves, in the same particular way the road crested the ridge before it dropped down toward Hazard in the east and climbed toward Whitesburg in the west. It was quieter than it had been 15 years ago. It would probably always be quieter than it had been 15 years ago, but it was not empty. Not anymore. Then she slept. In the weeks that followed, the garage found its new rhythm in the way that a river found its new course after something had changed the landscape it ran through. Not suddenly, not all at once, but steadily, with the patient confidence of water that knew where it was going. Hank Flynn started stopping by on Fridays, not with a vehicle that needed work, at least not always, sometimes just to sit on the porch for 20 minutes with a cup of coffee before he drove the rest of the way to his property. He and Dorothy talked about the county, mostly about the mine closures and the road conditions, and who was planting what this year, and the particular way the deer had moved into the lower fields this past October. It was the kind of conversation that accumulated into something over time, the knowledge of a shared place and the shared attention to its changes. His wife sent pies twice. Dorothy sent back the pie tins with a jar of the apple butter she made each fall from the trees behind the house, the trees Charles had planted in 1999 from a handful of seedlings his aunt had given them, and which now in their maturity produced more apples than she could ever use alone. The church auxiliary women came out one Saturday in October, not for a vehicle, but to bring food and to see the new roof and the new sign and to meet Dorothy properly, which was the specific purpose of the visit, though none of them said it directly. They walked the property with the assessing eyes of women who had been maintaining buildings in this county for decades, and they approved of the work, which Dorothy registered as a higher compliment than most of the other compliments she had received in her life. The youngest of them, a woman named Ida, who could not have been more than 35, and who had the direct manner of someone who had not yet learned to soften her observations, looked at the garage interior for a long time, and then said, "My brother has a truck that nobody has been able to fix correctly in 2 years. Can I send him out?" "Send him out," Dorothy said. He came the following Tuesday. The problem had been misdiagnosed 3 times. Dorothy found it in 40 minutes. She fixed it in an hour and a half. She charged him fair, and he left with the expression of a man whose chronic problem had finally been solved, which was one of her favorite expressions, one she had been seeing on people's faces for 44 years and had never grown tired of. He told his sister. His sister told the other women at the auxiliary. The auxiliary had connections to half the county. By November, Dorothy had a wait list for appointments for the first time in 7 years. She called Harrison on the evening she wrote down the last appointment that would fit in the calendar for the month of December. "You were right," she said. About what specifically he said. She could hear him smiling. It was a small sound in his voice, a particular quality of attention that she had learned to recognize. About the noise, she said. It moved nationally, and then it came back local. The way noise does when it is about something true. He was quiet for a moment. "How is the calendar looking?" "Full," she said. She said it simply. Full. There was a pause on the line. She could hear the sound of, wherever he was, some kind of road noise, a highway, which meant he was on the bike, which meant he had pulled over to answer, which was the kind of small consideration that you noticed when you had been paying attention to a person for a few months. "Dorothy," he said, "that is the whole point of it." "I know," she said. "I know it is." She set the phone down and looked at the calendar on the workbench. Every line filled in her handwriting. The handwriting that was not as good as Charles's had been, but was precise in the way of a person who had spent 44 years writing notes on repair orders where precision was the difference between fixing the right thing and fixing the wrong one. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned off the light and went in to make dinner. The summer after which was the summer of the second full year since the morning 65 headlights came around the bend of Route 23. Dorothy had a conversation with Daniel that she thought about for a long time afterward. He had been coming out every Saturday for 8 months by then. He was better than she had expected him to become this quickly, which was saying something because her expectations for him had been high from the beginning. He had the particular combination of qualities that made someone genuinely good at this work: the patience to listen to a machine without imposing a diagnosis on it before the machine had finished speaking, the honesty to say what he did not know rather than guessing in a way that created more problems than it solved, and the hands-on instinct that was either native to a person or it was not and could not be entirely taught. That Saturday, they were working on a 2011 pickup that belonged to a woman named Lorene, who had driven it from Hayden and who had 3 separate things wrong with it that a lesser diagnostician would have treated as one complicated problem, when in fact they were 3 simple problems that had been accumulating independently for different reasons over different timescales. Dorothy had set Daniel to finding all 3 without telling him there were 3. This was a test of a specific quality, the willingness to keep looking after you had found one answer, to resist the satisfaction of the single explanation. He found all 3. He told her about each one in the order he had found them, the order being the diagnostic order, which was also the most logical order, which told her something about how he was thinking. "Good," she said. "Now which one do you fix first?" He looked at the truck. He said the answer, and he said the reason for the answer, which was the more important part. She nodded. "That is right." She was quiet for a moment. "You are getting it." He looked at her with an expression that was partway between surprise and pleasure, the expression of someone who has been working very hard for something and is not entirely sure they have earned it yet, and is surprised to hear that they might have. "My uncle used to work on cars," he said. "He would have liked watching you." She looked at him. "Did he teach you?" "He tried," Daniel said. "I was not paying enough attention then. He died when I was 16. He paused. "I think about that sometimes. How much I could have learned if I had been paying attention." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father on Car Fork, the milk crate under her feet, the tools that were too big for her hands then and fit them now. She thought about the things she had not written down, the lumber grade, the things Charles had known that she had not thought to ask about before. There was no more time to ask. "You are paying attention now," she said. He nodded. "Yeah, that is what matters," she said. "You cannot go back. You pay attention now." He went back to work. She went back to work. The afternoon light came in through the bay door at the angle it came in at this time of year, low and slanted, catching the dust in the air above the workbench and turning it gold. The garage smelled the way it had always smelled and was full of the sounds it had always been full of and was the place it had always been. She was the mechanic of Route 23. She had always been the mechanic of Route 23. That had not changed, and it was not going to change, and she was in the full and accurate meaning of the word grateful. Outside the bay door, the road ran through the hills. One truck went by, then a car, then after a gap of several minutes, a motorcycle, just one, heading east toward Whitesburg at a steady pace. No hurry, just the road and the hills, in the late summer afternoon, and the sound of a well-maintained engine doing exactly what it was designed to do. She listened until it was gone. Then she listened to the next thing. And the thing after that, that was all it was. That was the whole of it. You listened. You paid attention. You did the work. The rest took care of itself.